Once we have her fortune, the wedding is over." Those were the words Catherine Livingston heard through a closed door, spoken by the man who had kissed her hand and called her the answer to every prayer he'd ever whispered. 3 days before she was meant to walk down the aisle and give him everything she learned, she was never the bride. She was the transaction. But here is what Edward Caldwell never counted on. Catherine didn't run. She stayed. And if you've ever loved someone who saw your worth as a number, stay with us, because this story is for you. Subscribe, and don't miss a single word. The morning was the kind Virginia served up in late October, like a quiet apology. Crisp air, gold light through the elm trees, the smell of wood smoke drifting from the manor chimneys. Catherine Livingston had ridden 3 hours from the Livingston estate, with a letter folded against her heart, and a smile she hadn't worn in years. She was 31 years old, and she had spent most of those years being practical about love. Practical was the word her mother had used. Sensible, measured. A woman of Catherine's standing didn't chase feelings, she cultivated partnership. She chose wisely. She considered legacy and name and the long arithmetic of shared futures. And then Edward Caldwell had walked into a winter assembly in Richmond and asked her to dance without once glancing at the pearls around her neck. And Catherine had quietly, carefully, against every sensible instinct she possessed, fallen. She pressed a hand to her coat pocket, now feeling the edge of his letter through the wool. "I cannot wait until you become my wife." He had written that. Those exact words. She had read them so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. 3 days. 3 more days, and she would be Catherine Caldwell. She would leave behind the careful loneliness of the Livingston house, the silent portraits of ancestors who had all managed to outlive their happiness, and she would begin something real. She handed her horse to the stable boy and walked toward the front entrance of Caldwell Manor. The butler, an older man named Graves, who had always treated her with quiet warmth, opened the door before she could knock. "Miss Livingston." Something shifted in his expression, not quite alarm, not quite pity. Something in between that she didn't have the vocabulary for yet. "Mr. Caldwell he's in the study, miss, with his mother." "I know my way," she said and smiled. She did know her way. She had been to Caldwell Manor a dozen times in the months of their courtship. She knew which floorboards announced themselves and which corners of the hall stayed cold, regardless of the season. She knew the study was at the end of the east corridor, that the door was always slightly warped in its frame, and required a firm pull to open, that the window beyond it looked out over the south garden, where Edward had once cut her a late summer rose, and presented it with such deliberate formality that she'd had to look away to keep from laughing. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard his voice. She stopped. Not because she hadn't expected him to be speaking. She had. He was always speaking. Edward had a gift for easy conversation that she'd admired long before she admitted she admired anything about him. She stopped because of the particular quality of the voice. Flat. Deliberate. The voice of a man accounting. "The Livingston fortune will clear all Caldwell debts." Her hand found the wall beside her. "Within 2 years of the marriage," he continued, "we will be solvent. The Eastern properties can be restored. The creditors in Philadelphia will be settled." A pause. Then his mother's voice, low and careful. "And the girl?" Catherine did not breathe. "Catherine understands her role." Edward's tone didn't waver. "She is a sensible woman. She will manage the household. She will not interfere with the financial arrangements." "She has opinions, Edward. She has opinions about books and charity work." A pause that might have been almost fond, and that was somehow the worst part. "Those will not trouble us. She will expect a certain warmth. I will be a good husband. Flat. Certain. I will be attentive and respectful. That is what a gentleman owes his wife. And love." The silence stretched long enough that Catherine felt it physically, a tightening across her chest, a strange cold that had nothing to do with the October air. "Mother." Edward's voice carried the patience of a man who has explained something many times. "Love is a luxury that men with debts cannot afford. I will honor her. I will give her children and a name and security. She will want for nothing. Except a husband who married her for herself. She will never know the difference. Catherine's fingers curled against the wallpaper. She stood in that corridor for what felt like a very long time. The letter was still in her pocket. I cannot wait until you become my wife. She understood now what that sentence had actually meant. Not you. Not Catherine, who had stayed up past midnight reading to him from her father's library, who had argued with him about land reform until they were both laughing, who had let herself be known by him in ways she had guarded from everyone else. The fortune. He had been waiting for the fortune. She had been the wrapping on a gift he wanted to unwrap and discard. The ring on her finger, a Caldwell family piece. 3 diamonds set in a narrow gold band, which she had secretly considered beautiful, felt suddenly like a brand. She turned and walked back down the corridor the way she had come. Graves was still near the entrance. He did not look surprised to see her leaving. That she thought distantly told her something too. She retrieved her horse and rode back toward the Livingston estate without hurrying, because she did not trust herself to hurry. Hurrying meant feeling, and she could not afford to feel until she had thought. By the time she reached home, she had made 2 decisions. The first was that she would not weep. Not yet. The second was that she would not run. The cancellation of the engagement arrived at Caldwell Manor the following morning by messenger. No explanation. No apology. Simply Miss Livingston regrets that she must withdraw from the arrangement. Catherine was told later by her cousin Margaret, who had the particular talent for social intelligence, that Catherine had always envied that the news landed in the Caldwell household like a stone through glass. Edward went pale as a sheet. Margaret reported, perched on the edge of Catherine's settee, with the avid attention of someone watching a very good play. His mother apparently fainted, or performed a feint. You know how Eliza Caldwell is. I know, Catherine said. Everyone is saying you must have discovered something terrible. Everyone is very nearly right. Margaret leaned forward. Catherine, what happened? Catherine looked at her cousin, the woman who had been her closest confidant since childhood, who had danced at her come-out and sat beside her at their grandmother's funeral and talked her out of 2 previous engagements that had both been perfectly sensible and completely wrong. She considered telling her everything. I changed my mind, she said instead. Margaret studied her for a long moment. You're not going to run to Bath, are you? Or close yourself up in this house and tell everyone you've decided to become eccentric? No. Then what are you going to do? Catherine folded her hands in her lap. I'm going back. Silence. Back, Margaret repeated. To Caldwell Manor. Yes. Catherine, the man, just whatever he did, you canceled your engagement 3 days before the wedding. You cannot simply walk back through his front door. I can, Catherine said, if I walk through it as someone other than his fiancé. She had spent the night thinking it through. Not from grief. She would allow herself grief. Later she promised herself that much, but from something colder and more purposeful. She had been deceived by Edward Caldwell. She had been studied, courted, and selected the way a man selects a piece of property, and she had not seen it because she had not wanted to see it. She wanted to see it now. She wanted to understand what Edward Caldwell actually was beneath the easy charm and the deliberate attentiveness and the winter assembly dancing. She wanted to know whether the man she had believed in had ever existed at all, or whether the entire courtship had been a careful performance with no honest note in it anywhere, and she wanted to do that from the inside. Her cousin stared at her. You're going to go back to the house of the man who tried to acquire you, and do what exactly? Observe, Catherine said. A family friend. Nothing more. The Caldwells have known my family for 20 years. There is nothing unusual about a visit. There is everything unusual about this particular visit at this particular time. Margaret. Catherine met her cousin's eyes. He thought I didn't hear. He thought I would walk down that aisle not knowing. I want to understand the man who was so certain of that. I want to understand what he actually is. And then... She paused. Then I will decide what I am. She arrived at Caldwell Manor 4 days after the cancelled engagement, dressed plainly, driving herself in a small hired carriage, carrying nothing that announced her as a Livingston heiress except the quality of her posture, which she couldn't help. Graves opened the door. His expression said several things simultaneously, none of which his professional dignity would allow him to voice. Miss Livingston. Good afternoon, Graves. I've come to return a book I borrowed from the library. I thought if Mrs. Caldwell is receiving, I might pay a brief call. A pause that contained an entire conversation. Of course, miss, he said finally. Please come in. Eliza Caldwell received her in the front parlor, with the careful composure of a woman who had spent 40 years navigating situations that could not be survived without composure. She was a handsome woman in her late 50s, angular and silver-haired, with eyes that had seen a great deal and filed most of it away as useful. Catherine. No warmth, but no coldness either, something more complex than either. This is unexpected. I hope I haven't intruded. Catherine settled into the offered chair with the ease she had learned from a lifetime of rooms that required performance. I've been concerned that we might allow an awkward situation to become an estrangement. Our families have been neighbors for 20 years. I would hate for that to change. Eliza studied her the way a chess player studies a board mid-game. You are remarkably composed. I am trying to be sensible. That word again. Something moved behind Eliza's eyes. You are always described as sensible, Catherine. It has always struck me as an inadequate word for you. It was, Catherine thought, the most honest thing Eliza Caldwell had ever said to her. They sat for 40 minutes and discussed the autumn harvest and the condition of the Richmond roads and a mutual acquaintance's recent confinement, and Catherine watched the older woman the entire time and filed away what she saw. A woman who had made her peace with difficult choices by convincing herself they were inevitable. A woman who loved her son and had taught him that love was expressed through provision and protection and the maintenance of appearances, and who had never questioned whether there might be other ways to love. A woman who had asked through a study door. And what about Catherine? She had asked. That mattered, perhaps, even if the answer had not. Edward appeared at the threshold of the parlor 20 minutes before Catherine intended to leave. He stopped when he saw her, as if the floor had shifted beneath him, and in that unguarded half-second before his breathing caught up with his surprise, she saw something that complicated everything she had decided. He looked wretched, not guilty wretched, not the performative remorse of a man caught in a scheme. Wretched in the way of someone who had reached for something he believed he needed and found his hands empty in a way he hadn't anticipated. He recovered in an instant. The composure snapped back into place like a shutter. Miss Livingston. His voice was perfectly controlled. I wasn't aware you were calling. Briefly, she said and rose. I was just leaving. It was good to see you, Mrs. Caldwell. She turned to Edward with the exact degree of pleasantness that their former acquaintance warranted, and not 1 degree more. Mr. Caldwell. She left before either of them could find words adequate to the situation. She came back the following week, and the week after. Not often enough to draw comment. Not so rarely that it seemed deliberate. The Caldwells were her neighbors. It was natural that she might call. If anyone in Richmond's tight social orbit found the arrangement peculiar, they found it more peculiar to say so to Catherine's face, and so no one did. And in those careful visits Catherine began to see. She had expected to see calculation. She had expected to see the Edward she'd heard through the study door, the man who had spoken of her fortune and her compliance with the flat certainty of a man reviewing a ledger. She had braced herself to find that version of him at every turn. She found him instead doing something she hadn't accounted for. She found him struggling. She was in the East Garden. The 3rd week she had been permitted to cut some late chrysanthemums, an offer from Eliza that carried more meaning than the flowers themselves, when she heard Edward speaking to one of the groundskeepers. An older man, weathered and slow-moving, who handled the kitchen garden. Thomas, Edward's voice nearby. I heard you've been managing the far beds alone since James left. Yes, sir. Cautious. That's 3 acres of work for one man. I manage, sir. I'll speak to my steward tomorrow about temporary help. There's no reason you should be breaking your back over it. A pause. Then, with the particular dignity of someone unaccustomed to being considered, thank you, sir. Catherine kept her attention on the chrysanthemums. She catalogued it the way she had been cataloging everything, not as evidence of virtue, not as absolution, but as data. A man who spoke of the servants as instruments of the household, and then quietly arranged for an old groundskeeper to have assistance, was not a simple man. He was a contradictory one. She had not come back to forgive him. She had come back to understand him. The understanding was proving more complicated than the anger had been. The incident with Mrs. Hargrove happened on her 5th visit. Mrs. Hargrove was the widow of a former Caldwell tenant, an elderly woman of modest means who had apparently called on Eliza Caldwell to request with great embarrassment a brief extension on a small debt her late husband had owed the estate. Catherine was in the library when she heard the conversation through the adjacent door. She wasn't listening deliberately. She simply went still. Eliza's voice, careful. "The debt stands, Mrs. Hargrove. You understand that." The old woman's voice, smaller. "Yes, ma'am. I only thought it being winter coming, if there was any possibility." And then Edward's voice cutting across both of them cleanly. "The debt is forgiven, Mrs. Hargrove." Silence. "Edward," Eliza warning, "we are not collecting on the debts of widows." Flat. Final. The same tone he had used through the study door, but aimed entirely differently. "Graves will see you out and arrange for a cord of firewood to be sent to your cottage before the week is out." After Mrs. Hargrove had gone, Catherine heard his mother, "We cannot afford gestures, Edward. We cannot afford to become the kind of family that forecloses on elderly widows." A pause. "Father would not have done it. Your father's generosity is a significant contributor to our current situation." Then perhaps his generosity was the better part of him. Catherine closed the book she had not been reading and sat very still for a long time. She was preparing to leave on her 6th visit when Edward fell into step beside her as she crossed the front hall. It was the most direct contact they had had, the nearest approach to the conversation that had been waiting like a storm on the horizon since she'd first walked back through his door. "Miss Livingston." He kept his voice low. "May I ask you something?" She turned to face him fully. It was the first time she had done so since that morning in the corridor when she had not turned at all. "You may ask," she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man trying to read a document in a language he is only partly fluent in. "Why did you come back?" "I told your mother. We are neighbors, our families." "I know what you told my mother." Quietly. "I am asking what you told yourself." Catherine considered him. He was watching her with something she recognized after a moment as the same quality of attention she had originally admired in him. The way he listened, genuinely listened, without preparing his response before you had finished speaking. She had thought it rare in men of his station. She still did. "I came back," she said slowly, "because I heard something I was not meant to hear, and I needed to know whether the man who said it was the only version of you that existed." The silence between them was the most honest thing they had shared in months. His jaw tightened, not with denial, with recognition. "You heard everything." He absorbed that. She watched the moment land in him, not as surprise, but as the confirmation of something he had perhaps suspected and had been waiting to face. A muscle worked in his throat. "Then you know," he said quietly, "why I could not simply—" "I know what you said." Her voice was steady. "I know what you told your mother about what I was worth and how I would be managed. I know exactly what I was to you before the wedding." He did not flinch, which she gave him credit for. A smaller man would have made excuses immediately. Edward Caldwell stood in the fact of what she was saying and let it be what it was. "And now," his voice was rough at the edges. "Now," Catherine said, "I am trying to determine whether the man I thought you were ever existed at all, or whether I invented him because I wanted him to." She left before he could answer. She rode home with her hands steady on the reins, and her thoughts spinning loose from their moorings because the terrible, inconvenient, entirely unwelcome truth was this: she was no longer certain she had invented him. The evening she overheard him with his mother truly overheard, not through a door this time, but because she had returned to retrieve a glove she'd left in the parlor, and the library door was standing open. Was the evening everything shifted? Eliza had been speaking about the future, about the necessity of finding another arrangement. about a Miss Pemberton from Fredericksburg with adequate prospects and a father who was unlikely to ask difficult questions. "You should write to the Pembertons," Eliza said. "It has been 2 months, long enough for propriety." Edward's voice when it came was quiet enough that Catherine had to stand very still to catch it. "I don't want to write to the Pembertons." "Edward." She came back, mother. A pause. "She came back knowing what she heard, and she came back anyway, and she has sat in our parlor and our garden and our library for 2 months, watching. I don't know what she is watching for, but she is watching, and I cannot stop thinking. Don't. I treated her like a solution to an arithmetic problem. You treated her like a gentleman of means treats a suitable match. I treated her like she wasn't a person." The self-condemnation in it was quiet and thorough, the condemnation of a man who has looked at himself honestly and not much liked what he found. "I sat in that study and talked about her fortune and her compliance, and whether she would know the difference, and she is—" He stopped. "She is what?" His mother very carefully. "Remarkable," Edward said. "Like a confession. Like something it cost him. She is the most remarkable person I have ever met, and I was so busy seeing what she could fix that I forgot to see what she was." Catherine stood in the hallway with the glove in her hand, and something complicated happening in her chest that she did not have words for yet. She left without retrieving the other one. The letter arrived at the Livingston house 3 days later. Not a long letter. Edward did not write long letters. He was not a man who hid behind prose. 3 sentences in handwriting she had memorized months ago. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know what I said, and what I intended, and what you deserve for it. I am asking anyway. Will you walk with me?" Catherine read it 4 times. She wrote back 2 words. "Tomorrow, noon." The walk lasted 2 hours and covered the ground between their properties, the long meadow path that both estates bordered, the one they had walked twice during the courtship with her cousin as chaperone, laughing about nothing in particular. They were not laughing now. He told her everything. The debts. Not the polished version, the real one, the number that kept his mother awake, and had made him look at the Livingston name across a Richmond assembly room and calculate before he had ever spoken a word to the woman beside it. The pressure that had shaped him a father who died leaving more debts than assets, and a sense of duty so deeply installed in Edward's character that he had never questioned whether duty and decency might sometimes point in different directions. The moment in the study when he had said those words and heard them come out of his own mouth, and felt even then that something was wrong, not wrong enough to stop him, God help him, but wrong. Catherine walked and listened. She did not offer absolution. She did not fill his silences with comfort. When he had finished, she said, "I'm not angry with you for being in debt. I know. I am angry with you for deciding without asking me that debt was something to solve through deception. As if I were an account balance, and not a person with the capacity to be told the truth and choose accordingly." He was quiet for a long moment. "Would you have chosen accordingly?" She looked at him. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I might have. I might not have. But I would have chosen. And you took that from me." He didn't argue. She respected him for it. "You came back," he said finally. "I came back to understand you." "Have you?" She thought of the groundskeeper and the firewood, and the way he'd said remarkable in the dark of the library when he thought no one was listening. "I'm beginning to," she said. That was all she gave him. But it was not nothing, and they both knew it. She turned back toward the Livingston estate as the light started to go golden over the meadow, and he let her go without asking for more than she had offered. And that restraint, that patience, that willingness to accept exactly what she gave, without pressing for more, was perhaps the truest thing she had seen in him yet. She walked home, with the October air cold on her face, and something cautious and carefully unnameable beginning to grow in the place where the wound had been. It was not forgiveness. It was not love. Not yet. Not simply, not cleanly. It was the beginning of the question of whether Edward Caldwell was a man who could earn back the thing he had so thoroughly squandered. And Catherine Livingston, sensible, practical, unremarkable. Catherine, who had spent 31 years being careful and had been deceived anyway, had decided that she was going to stay long enough to find out. The question Catherine had carried home from that meadow walk didn't keep her awake the way grief does, restless and formless and without resolution. It kept her awake the way a difficult book does. The kind you put down and pick up again, turning the same passage over until you've worn a groove in it. Is the man I thought I knew real, or did I build him out of what I wanted? She had built things before. She knew the particular self-deception of wanting someone to be more than they were. She had done it with her father, who was charming and beloved, and had never once in her memory prioritized her comfort over his convenience. She had done it with a young officer she'd admired at 19, who had turned out to be exactly as shallow as her cousin Margaret had warned, and exactly as handsome as Catherine had hoped, and who had eventually married a girl from Charleston who didn't argue with him. She had learned from both of those experiences to distrust her own instincts when it came to men she found interesting. And she found Edward Caldwell deeply inconveniently interesting. That was the problem. If she had simply despised him cleanly completely, the way a sensible woman despised a man who had courted her for her bank account, and her inheritance, and her compliance, everything would have been straightforward. She would have stayed away. She would have let Richmond society reach whatever conclusions it chose, waited out the gossip, and eventually found some quieter life on the far edge of respectability that didn't require her to think about him at all. Instead, she was waking up at 5 in the morning, turning over the memory of him saying remarkable, like it was a word he'd discovered for the first time. Margaret arrived on a Tuesday without sending notice ahead, which was her way of ensuring she would find Catherine in her actual state, rather than a managed version of it. She came through the front door with a look on her face that meant she had heard something. You walked with him. Catherine didn't look up from the letter she was composing. Good morning, Margaret. 2 hours, in the South Meadow. Margaret settled herself into the chair across the writing desk with the purposeful energy of someone prepared to be there for a while. Frances Whitmore saw you from her upstairs window and told half of Richmond by supper. Frances Whitmore should occupy herself more productively. Catherine. A pause. What are you doing? She set down her pen. She looked at her cousin, the person who knew her best, who had watched her cancel an engagement with more self-possession than most women could manage, who had asked the right questions and accepted incomplete answers with more grace than she deserved. I am trying, she said carefully, to determine whether Edward Caldwell is a man who is capable of genuine change, or a man who is capable of performing the appearance of it. Margaret stared at her. And you can't make that determination from a safe distance. No, I cannot. Because you still have feelings for him. Because I am not willing to make a judgment about someone's character from behind a cancelled engagement and a broken heart. She picked up her pen again. I saw what I saw, Margaret. I heard what I heard. But I also saw him forgive a widow's debt and arrange firewood for her winter, and stand in front of his mother's disapproval without flinching. And I heard him, when he thought no one was listening, call me remarkable. She paused. A man who sees me only as a fortune does not say that in an empty room. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Or he's very good at being seen. He didn't know anyone was there. Another silence. You're going back again. Yes. And you're not going to tell me exactly what you're looking for. I'll tell you when I find it. Catherine looked up. Or when I'm certain it isn't there. Her cousin left an hour later without having changed a single one of Catherine's intentions, which they both understood was the real purpose of the visit, to confirm that Catherine's intentions were in fact her own. They were. November settled over Virginia like a decision. The easy warmth of October was gone, and the countryside made no apologies for it. Catherine arrived at Caldwell Manor on the first truly cold morning of the season to find the household in a state of controlled disruption. The butler Graves met her at the door with his usual composure, layered over something more strained than usual. 3 carriages stood in the front drive that hadn't been there on her previous visits. Voices carried from inside too many voices, and at least 2 of them were male and unfamiliar. Company, she asked. Mr. Caldwell's creditors, Graves said very quietly, have sent representatives. She understood in an instant. The debt she had known about in the abstract, the number Edward had spoken of, honestly during their walk, the inherited disaster he had been trying to solve had arrived in person. She started to say that she would come back another time. Miss Livingston. Edward appeared at the top of the entrance steps. He had clearly come from some difficult conversation. His jaw was set. His eyes had the particular quality of a man who has been managing other people's alarm for several hours and is running low on the resources it requires. He stopped when he saw her, and something in his expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but the particular steadying that comes from seeing a familiar face in the middle of a situation that has no familiar footing. "You should go," he said, not unkindly. "I heard." "Then you understand why." "I understand why you'd rather I didn't witness this." She kept her voice low. "But I'm not here as a witness. I'm here as whatever I am." A pause. Neither of them had a word for it yet. "Do you need anything?" He looked at her for a long moment. A man accustomed to managing alone, unused to being asked that question by someone who meant it. "No," he said finally. "Thank you. No." She nodded. She left. But she came back the following day, and she asked Graves quietly how Mr. Caldwell had managed, and Graves told her with the careful loyalty of a man who had served the family for 30 years and was frightened for it, that the meeting had been difficult, and that 2 of the 3 representatives had agreed to extended terms, and the 3rd had not, and that Mr. Caldwell had been in his study until 2 in the morning. She went home and sat with that information for a long time. The week that changed everything began with a T. Catherine had not expected to be significant. Eliza Caldwell had invited her. Formally. A written note, proper stationery language that managed to be simultaneously gracious and entirely unreadable. Catherine accepted because refusing would have been cowardice, and she had not come this far to be a coward. She arrived to find only Eliza. No Edward. No other guests. Just the 2 of them and a tea service, and the accumulated weight of everything that sat between them. Eliza poured with steady hands and said nothing for a full 3 minutes. Catherine, who had spent her childhood at her mother's knee, learning that silence was a social instrument and not an enemy, waited. "I owe you an apology," Eliza said at last. Catherine looked at her. "Not for the arrangement itself." The older woman's voice was careful. "I won't apologize for trying to save this family. That was my duty, and I would make the same calculation again." A pause. "But I knew, Catherine. I knew what Edward intended. And I said nothing to you because I convinced myself that what you didn't know couldn't hurt you, and that the life you would have had here would have been adequate." "Adequate," Catherine repeated. "I know what that sounds like." "Do you?" Eliza met her gaze. "I was 18 when I married Edward's father. The arrangement was not dissimilar from the one we proposed to you. I told myself for 40 years that it was enough that comfort and security, and a man who was not unkind, was sufficient for a life." A pause that had 40 years in it. "I have never asked myself what else might have been possible. I did not want to ask. It seemed like a question that had no useful answer." The honesty of it landed hard. Eliza Caldwell was not a woman who made confessions easily. She was a woman who had organized her interior life around not needing to. "I'm not you," Catherine said quietly. "No." Eliza's voice carried something that might have been sadness, or might have been admiration, and in either case, was entirely genuine. "You are a great deal braver than I was at your age, than I have been at any age." She set down her cup. "I am telling you this because Edward he is trying. I want you to know that I see it. Whatever you decide, I see it." Catherine rode home in the thin afternoon light with Eliza Caldwell's voice in her ear, and a new layer added to her understanding of the household she had been quietly studying for 2 months. The mother who had made her peace with diminished expectations, and had therefore taught her son to do the same. The generational transmission of the idea that love was a luxury passed down as faithfully as debt. She was not ready to forgive, but she was beginning to see the architecture of the damage, and that was a different thing from excusing it. She encountered Edward alone for the first time, genuinely alone, without the managed distance of their previous meetings on the Thursday of that week. She had come to return 2 books she had borrowed from the library. Graves told her Edward was in the east sitting room and offered to announce her. She said it wasn't necessary, she would simply leave the books and go. She did not leave the books and go. Edward was at the writing desk by the window, deep enough in whatever he was working on that he didn't hear her in the doorway. She had a moment of him unobserved, his coat off, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his hair less composed than usual, a ledger open before him, and a letter half drafted to one side. He had his father's old account books stacked beside him, and he was cross-referencing something with the focused intensity of a man dismantling a problem one piece at a time. She must have made some sound because he looked up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "The books," she said, holding them up slightly, and felt immediately absurd. He rose. "I'll take them." "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't interrupt anything worth protecting." He glanced at the ledger with an expression that made no effort to be anything other than what it was: tired and frustrated and slightly resigned. "Just the ongoing project of learning to understand my own father's choices." She looked at the stacked books. His account records, 20 years of them. Edward sat back down, which was either an invitation or a forgetting, and she found herself taking 2 steps into the room before she had consciously decided to. He was generous and careless in equal measure. "Every time I find a debt, I also find a canceled loan, or a repaired tenant cottage, or some other thing he did quietly and didn't record properly. He was a better man than his ledgers suggest." A pause. "Also a worse one financially speaking. You're trying to understand him." "I'm trying to decide which of his choices I want to keep." Something quiet happened in the air between them. She came a step closer. The books were still in her hands. "The widow's debt," she said. "Firewood before the winter. An old groundskeeper who got help he wasn't expecting." He looked up at her. He understood what she was saying, that she had seen, that she had been watching more carefully than he had known. "Those were his choices," Catherine continued. "Not the debts. Those." A long silence. "You've been watching me a great deal more closely than I realized," he said. "I told you why I came back." "You said you came to understand me." "Yes." His voice was very quiet. "And do you yet?" She looked at him, at the rolled sleeves and the stacked ledgers, and the man who was dismantling his inheritance piece by piece, keeping the parts that were worth keeping, and said honestly, "I understand more than I did." She left the books on the corner of the desk and went. The event that became the true hinge of everything happened 9 days later at the Whitmore Assembly. Catherine had debated whether to attend. She had decided that hiding was worse than presence, and had allowed Margaret to dress her in the deep blue silk that her cousin had always said made her look like someone who had made irreversible decisions, Margaret's highest compliment. The Caldwells were there. They were always there. Eliza had maintained her social position through sheer force of sustained effort, and she had not allowed the broken engagement to alter her calendar. Catherine had expected that. What she had not expected was Dorothea Finch. Dorothea was 23, the daughter of a recently prosperous merchant family from Charlottesville with a face that made conversation unnecessary, and a father who was apparently entirely untroubled by debt or by daughters who expressed opinions. She had arrived in Richmond 2 weeks prior. She had, Catherine gathered from the particular quality of the room's attention, been pointed at Edward by at least 3 separate parties who considered themselves helpful. She watched Dorothea speak to Edward from across the room. She watched him respond with the easy, practiced courtesy. She knew well. The smile that involved his eyes, the forward lean that meant he was listening properly, rather than performing attention. She watched Dorothea laugh at something he said. Catherine turned and found a glass of punch and occupied herself with a conversation about nothing with an acquaintance she couldn't afterward remember, and told herself that what she was feeling was not jealousy. It was. Obviously it was. What shook her was not the jealousy itself. She had enough self-knowledge to identify the feeling without being ambushed by it. What shook her was the revelation embedded in the feeling. You did not feel jealousy about a man you had written off. You did not feel that particular seizing cold in your chest over someone you had concluded was beyond recovery. She had not concluded that. She was standing with the glass. She wasn't drinking, and understanding with the clarity that comes at inconvenient moments that she had spent 2 months telling herself she was conducting an objective assessment of Edward Caldwell's character, when what she was actually doing was conducting an argument with her own feelings, and losing. "Miss Livingston," she turned. Edward was behind her. He had crossed the room. She hadn't watched him do. It hadn't seen him leave Dorothea's company, and he was close enough that they were in the private acoustic territory of a ballroom where private conversation is possible if both parties are careful. "You look," he said quietly, "like someone doing a calculation." "I often do." "I know." A pause. "This one looks more difficult than usual." She turned to face him fully. She had promised herself that she would not be careful with him, that the point of everything she had done in these 2 months was to see clearly rather than to manage the impression she made. So she did not smile and redirect the conversation. "I watched you speak to Miss Finch." He didn't pretend not to understand. "I know you did. Your mother thinks you should write to her." "My mother thinks a great many things. She's not wrong that you should move forward." The words were steady. She was proud of them. "You have a family to consider, responsibilities. I am not. I haven't made you any promises, Edward. I haven't given you any reason to." Catherine. Low. Careful. Using her name the way he only did when he meant it precisely. "I have not thought about writing to anyone." "You should. I'm sure I should." He was looking at her with the full attention she had first noticed in a Richmond assembly room, and had been disarmed by then, and was being disarmed by now, and she was tired of pretending otherwise. "I find it difficult." "Why?" The word came out more direct than she had intended, but she didn't take it back. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment, she saw him make some internal decision, the same quality of moment she recognized from the walk in the meadow, where he had chosen honesty over management. "Because," he said quietly, "I am standing in a room with you, and that makes every other consideration feel entirely theoretical." She did not answer. She did not trust her voice to be steady if she did. She excused herself after another moment, and went to find Margaret, and told her she was ready to leave, and Margaret looked at her face and asked no questions, and found her cloak, and they left, and Catherine said nothing. The entire drive home, and Margaret, who was the best kind of friend, said nothing either. The letter came the next morning, not from Edward, from his mother. Eliza wrote formally, but without her usual buffer of social language. She had heard, she wrote, that a Mr. Harland Finch had approached the Caldwell family about a potential arrangement between his daughter and Edward. She wanted Catherine, though she acknowledged it was not her place, that Edward had refused the initial conversation entirely, and had told his mother that evening that he was not prepared to enter into any arrangement until he had resolved what he described as the situation with Miss Livingston. "I do not know what resolution you are seeking," Eliza wrote. "I am not certain Edward does either. But I believe you deserve to know that he is not hedging his position. He is waiting. Whether what he is waiting for exists is a question only you can answer." Catherine read the letter 3 times. She set it face down on her writing desk and went to find something practical to do, because she needed something practical, or she was going to do something rash. She ended up in her father's old study, which she had kept unchanged since his death and rarely entered because it still smelled like him. Pipe tobacco and old books, and a kind of well-intentioned neglect she had loved him for, even as it infuriated her. His papers were still in some disorder she had never gotten around to organizing. She sat at his desk and looked at them and thought about what it meant to wait for something you weren't sure existed. She thought about Edward refusing the Finch arrangement. She thought about a man in rolled sleeves cross-referencing 20 years of his father's ledgers, keeping the parts worth keeping. She thought about a letter with 3 sentences in it. "I know I have no right. I know what I said. I am asking anyway." She opened the center drawer of her father's desk, which she hadn't opened in years, and found, because the universe had a sense of the theatrical, apparently, a letter her father had written to her mother before they married. She had found it as a girl, and read it with enormous seriousness, and returned it to exactly this drawer. She read it now. He had been afraid she saw reading between the formal lines with adult comprehension rather than a child's romantic gloss. Afraid that he would disappoint her. Afraid that he was asking for something he didn't know how to be worthy of. And he had been right to be afraid in some ways. Her parents' marriage had not been a love story in the grand sense, but it had been a life, and there had been kindness in it, and loyalty, and moments of genuine grace between two people who had chosen each other imperfectly and tried anyway. Trying anyway had always struck her as a diminished standard. Sitting in her father's study, she wondered if she had been wrong about that. She went back to Caldwell Manor on a Tuesday in early December, 3 weeks after the Whitmore Assembly, and did not pretend the visit was about borrowed books or borrowed anything. Edward was in the stables when she arrived, not riding but working. She found him with a horse she didn't recognize, a young animal that had apparently arrived recently and was not settling easily. And he was doing what you do with frightened animals, standing quietly, speaking in a low voice, waiting. He heard her come in and looked up, but didn't move from where he was, because moving would have unsettled the horse. Bought at auction last month. Previous owner wasn't careful with it. Will it settle? Eventually. He glanced at her. Most things do, given enough time and the right handling. It was not, she decided, an accident that he had said it that way. She crossed the stable and stood on the other side of the animal. She reached out slowly and let the horse smell her hand, and it skittered slightly and then settled, and Edward watched her do it with an expression she had no word for. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told the horse's nose, because it was easier than looking at him directly. "At the Whitmore Assembly." "Have you?" "I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks. And—" She looked up. He was watching her with the same quality of attention she had decided was real, that particular focus that felt like being seen rather than assessed, and which she still couldn't entirely trust, but could no longer entirely dismiss. "I am not in a position to forgive you," she said. "Not fully, not yet. What you intended at the beginning of this was a significant thing, Edward. I am not going to pretend it wasn't. I know. But I am also—" She stopped, started again. "I am also a woman who came back twice and has been coming back for 2 months because I am not willing to let fear make my decisions for me. And I have been watching you. And I have not been watching you do what a man does when he is performing improvement." The horse shifted. Edward steadied it without looking away from her. "What have you been watching me do?" he asked quietly. "Learn," she said. "Badly and imperfectly and without any guarantee of success, exactly the way it's actually done." A long silence. The cold in the stable. The sound of the animal breathing. "Catherine." His voice was rough and careful at once. "I am not going to ask you to make any decision. I am not going to ask you for anything you aren't prepared to give. But I want you to know—" He stopped. "Tell me. The man in the study. The one who talked about your fortune and your compliance, and whether you would know the difference." He met her eyes. "I know you heard him. I know you carry that. But I need you to know that I hear him too, and he is not a man I intend to keep being." She looked at him for a long time. "That," she said finally, "is the most honest thing you have said to me." "It's not enough." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. But it's a beginning." She left the stable with the winter air cold on her face, and something she refused to name, yet moving in her chest. Not trust, not quite, not yet enough to call it that. But the precursor to trust. The first careful weight-bearing on a joint that had been badly injured, the tentative test of whether it would hold. She walked to her carriage, thinking of her father's letter in the desk drawer. Trying anyway. She had been wrong about that as a standard. She could see that now. It was not a diminished thing to try anyway. It was in fact the whole of it. The only honest thing anyone could offer anyone else, the willingness to try imperfectly, without guarantees towards something that mattered. She did not know yet if Edward Caldwell was capable of it. She was beginning to believe he was. And that belief, fragile and unwelcome and entirely real, was going to change everything. The belief that Edward Caldwell was capable of genuine change was not a comfortable thing to carry. Catherine had expected that once she named it even privately, Even only to herself, it would simplify matters. That the naming would collapse the tension she had been living inside for 2 months into something more manageable. That she would wake up the morning after the stable and find the path forward obvious. Instead, she woke up at 4 in the morning with the absolute certainty that she had made a catastrophic error in judgment, followed immediately by the equally certain knowledge that she hadn't followed, by the exhausting recognition that both of those things could be simultaneously true, and that she was going to have to live with that ambiguity for some time longer. Margaret came on Wednesday and found her in the garden, despite the December cold, pruning things that did not strictly require pruning. "You've come to a decision," Margaret said, reading her the way only someone who had known her for 30 years could. "I've come to a realization." "Is there a difference?" "Yes." Catherine set down the pruning shears. "A decision implies I've resolved something. I've only understood something." "Which is?" She looked at her cousin. "That I am not conducting an assessment of Edward Caldwell. I haven't been for some time. I've been waiting to feel safe enough to admit what I already know." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "And what do you already know?" Catherine picked up the shears again. "That I'm in love with a man who gave me very good reasons not to be, and that I haven't the faintest idea what to do about it." Margaret sat down on the cold stone bench behind her without a word. And then quietly, "I have a very strong opinion about what you should do about it." "I know you do. You're not going to take it. Not yet." Catherine cut a dead branch cleanly at the joint. "There's something happening at Caldwell Manor. Something Edward hasn't told me. I can feel it in the way his mother writes, and the way Graves looks at me when I arrive. Something is moving toward a point, and I want to understand what it is before I—" She stopped. "Before I do anything that can't be undone." She was right. She didn't know yet how right. The thing moving toward a point arrived in the form of a letter that was not addressed to Catherine. She knew about it because Graves told her. Not directly, Graves was too loyal and too careful for directness. But when she arrived at Caldwell Manor on the second Friday of December, he met her at the door with an expression she had come to read accurately, and he said in the measured tone of a man choosing his words with surgical precision, "Mr. Caldwell is in the study, miss. He has been there since yesterday afternoon. He has not eaten." She understood this was not a neutral statement of fact. "Is Mrs. Caldwell at home?" "Mrs. Caldwell is visiting the Hargrove estate, miss." "Thank you, Graves." She went to the study. She knocked. Nothing. She tried the handle. The door was unlocked and stepped inside. Edward was at the desk. The room had the close, airless quality of a space that has been sealed against the world for too long. Papers everywhere. 2 candles burned down to stubs. A glass of something untouched at his elbow. He looked like a man who had been fighting a battle alone in a room for 24 hours, which was, Catherine gathered, almost exactly what had happened. He looked up when she entered. His expression went through several things, rapidly. Surprise, relief, the instinctive composure that tried to overlay both and didn't quite manage it. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "You haven't eaten since yesterday." "Graves has an excessive regard for my welfare." She crossed the room and looked at the papers on the desk without touching them. She was not a woman who read other people's documents uninvited. But she could see enough from where she stood to understand the shape of it. Legal correspondence, formal and dense, with a seal she recognized. Her own family's solicitor's seal. She went very still. "Edward." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "How much can you see from there?" "Enough." Her voice was careful. "That is Hartwell and Associates' letterhead." "Yes." "My father's solicitors." "Yes." She sat down in the chair across the desk because her legs had made a decision her brain hadn't caught up to yet. "Tell me." He pushed the top letter toward her. She read it. She read it again because the first time didn't fully penetrate. The letter was from a Mr. Theodore Ashworth, who had apparently served as a secondary trustee of the Livingston estate, a position she had not known existed, which was itself alarming, and who had, in the aftermath of the cancelled engagement, made a series of legal claims against both the Livingston estate and the Caldwell family that were creative aggressive, and if she understood the implications correctly, potentially devastating. Ashworth was contending that the original engagement agreement between the Livingston and Caldwell families had created a binding preliminary contract under Virginia property law, and that the unilateral cancellation by Catherine constituted a breach, and that the resulting damages, specifically the Caldwell family's reasonable expectation of financial relief, entitled him as trustee to assert a lien against certain Livingston property on the Caldwell family's behalf. It was, she recognized slowly, nonsense. It was legally creative nonsense constructed by someone who knew enough law to make nonsense sound authoritative, and it would cost significant money and significant time to challenge, and it was clearly designed to achieve something other than what it claimed to be pursuing. "Who is Theodore Ashworth?" she asked. "A man your late father made trustee of a secondary property account in 1812. Edward's voice was controlled and exhausted in equal measure. "A man I was not aware of until this letter arrived. A man who has apparently been watching the progress of our engagement with considerable interest. And the cancellation of it. Yes." She set the letter down. "He doesn't actually believe this claim is legally sound. No, he's a tool, not a lawyer." Edward leaned back. "Someone is using him. Someone who wants access to the Livingston estate and has calculated that the disruption of our engagement and the legal chaos that follows gives them an opening." She felt the cold move up her spine. Not fear exactly. Something more purposeful than fear. "Who?" He met her eyes. This was the part she understood that he had been sitting alone with for 24 hours. The part he had not wanted to tell her. "I have a suspicion," he said, "and I need you to be prepared for it to be someone you know." His name was Gerald Ashby, a cousin of Catherine's, distant on her father's side, a man she had met perhaps 4 times in her life, and remembered as someone with the particular combination of personal charm and financial instability that tends to make itself felt eventually. She had not thought of him in years. She had not known he had been in contact with Theodore Ashworth. She had not known he had any interest in the Livingston estate beyond the ordinary hopes of a distant relation for a comfortable legacy. She had not known until Edward showed her the secondary correspondence he had spent 24 hours tracking down through his own solicitor that Gerald Ashby had been quietly positioning himself for 3 years against the possibility of Catherine's marriage, which under certain interpretations of certain provisions of her father's will could shift the terms of her inheritance in ways that would expose particular assets to outside claims. She sat with this information for a long time. "I was never trying to get me to cancel the engagement," she said finally. "No." Edward's voice was very quiet. "He was hoping I would." The distinction hit her like cold water. Gerald Ashby had known about the Caldwell debts. He had known someone had told him some chain of information she didn't yet fully understand about Edward's financial motivations for the marriage. And he had been counting on those motivations to make Edward behave badly enough, or obviously enough, that Catherine would discover the truth and break the engagement herself. "He needed me to be the one who canceled it," she said. "Yes, a breach on your side creates legal exposure that a breach on his side wouldn't. So he needed you to be what you were." She looked up. "He needed you to be the man who married me for the fortune, and then he needed me to find out." The room was very quiet. "I played my part," Edward said. "No self-pity in it. Just the plain acknowledgement of a man who has stared at an unpleasant fact long enough to be accurate about it. You didn't know. That is a very generous reading. It's an accurate one." She stood up. She needed to move. "You were exactly what he expected you to be, and you gave him exactly what he needed, and now he is using it as a legal lever." She turned to face him. "What does he actually want, Edward? Not the legal claim. What does he actually want?" "The eastern parcel." Edward pulled another document from the stack. 40 acres of the Livingston eastern boundary. Timber rights primarily. Worth considerably more than it appears if the survey reports from last spring are accurate. She stared at him. "How do you know about the survey reports from last spring?" "Because my solicitor found them in Ashby's papers when we began investigating." A pause. "He has been planning this for at least 3 years, Catherine. The engagement, the marriage, the cancellation, all of it was anticipated. You were never a person in his accounting either." It should have made her furious. It did make her furious, a clean, hot fury that was clarifying rather than destructive. But underneath the fury was something else, something she needed a moment to identify. She had spent 2 months studying Edward Caldwell's character. She had been doing it in the belief that the central question of her immediate future was whether he was capable of being someone worth trusting. It turned out she had been asking the wrong question about the wrong person. "We need to speak to Hartwell and Associates," she said. "My solicitors directly, not through Ashby's intermediary. And we need the survey documents, and I want to see my father's original will with the trustee provisions in full." Edward looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition, like a man watching someone pick up a tool and use it with complete authority. "You've done this before," he said. "My father's estate was complicated." She turned toward the door. "I spent 2 years after his death understanding it. I have not been a passive holder of the Livingston inheritance. I know exactly what I own and what it's worth and what can threaten it." She paused at the threshold. "Graves said you haven't eaten. That needs to change before we make any decisions. Clear thinking requires fuel." A beat of silence. Then quietly, "You are remarkable." She turned back. He wasn't saying it the way he had in the library, half confessional addressed to the empty room. He was saying it directly to her in full daylight with nothing between them. "Don't," she said, but without heat. "I know I have no standing. That's not why." She held his gaze. "I need to think about Gerald Ashby and property law and my father's will. And when you look at me like that, I find it considerably harder to think." I was quiet for a moment. Then very carefully, "I will take that as the most encouraging thing you have said to me in 3 months." She left before the warmth in her chest could reach her face, and went to tell Graves that Mr. Caldwell needed a meal and a fire that hadn't burned down to ash. The meeting with the solicitors happened on a Monday in Richmond, in a room that smelled of old paper and the particular mustiness of documents that have been important for a long time. Catherine's lead solicitor was a sharp-minded man named Patterson, who had served her father and whose eyebrows communicated at least as much as his words. He read the Ashby correspondence with progressive shades of professional displeasure rising visibly in his expression. Edward sat beside Catherine, not behind her, beside her. She had told him directly that morning that she expected him to be present as an equal participant and not as a background figure, because this concerned his family as well as hers, and she was not managing this situation alone. He had looked at her with that quality of attention she had stopped trying to armor herself against and said simply, "Understood." Patterson set down the last letter. "This is aggressive, and it is creative, and it is almost entirely without merit." "Almost," Catherine said. "There is a provision in the original Livingston Trust document, your grandfather's trust, not your father's will, that creates a narrow window under which a secondary trustee could assert an interest in property dispositions following certain inheritance events. Ashworth appears to have found it. The claim itself won't survive challenge." He paused. "But the challenge will take time. And during that time, Ashby can file for a preliminary injunction against the disposition of the eastern parcel, which would effectively freeze any sale or development of that land." "That's what he wants," Edward said. "He doesn't need to win the legal case. He needs to freeze the parcel long enough to make another purchase from a distressed seller." Patterson looked at him with revised interest. "Explain." "The timber rights on that parcel are worth approximately 4 times current valuation if the survey results from last spring are incorporated. Ashby knows about the survey. He needs the parcel frozen while he arranges the capital to purchase it either directly from Catherine under duress or from a third party he maneuvers into the transaction. The legal claim isn't the play. The delay is." A silence in the room. Patterson looked at Catherine. "Your companion has a good mind for this." "I'm aware," she said. "Can you produce the survey documents?" "My solicitor has them," Edward said. "They were filed as part of the estate investigation I began last month. We can have copies here by Thursday." "Good." Patterson made a note. "If we can demonstrate that Ashby has had prior knowledge of the survey results, we can make a compelling argument that the legal claim is being filed in bad faith specifically to manufacture leverage over the property. That changes the legal character of the action significantly. He looked at Catherine. This will not be quiet. If we pursue this the way it needs to be pursued, Gerald Ashby's actions will become a matter of public record. Good, Catherine said. Patterson blinked. He had expected hesitation. He attempted to use my personal circumstances, a broken engagement, a situation of genuine emotional difficulty, as a legal instrument, she said. He counted on my being too disrupted or too private or too concerned with appearances to look closely at what he was doing. I want the record to show exactly what it was. Patterson smiled a dry professional smile, the smile of a man who has spent 30 years watching people be more complicated than expected. Very well, Miss Livingston. Let us begin. They rode back from Richmond in the same carriage because it made practical sense, and they had somewhere in the past 3 hours passed some threshold that made the company natural. The winter light was going early, and the road between Richmond and home was familiar enough that neither of them needed to watch it. The silence between them had changed. It had been carrying weight since the beginning, the weight of what Catherine knew, what Edward had done, the long complicated business of two people trying to see each other honestly after a bad beginning. Now the weight was different. Not lighter exactly, but more defined, shared. Ashby could have simply approached me, she said. He could have presented evidence of the survey value and made an offer for the parcel. You would have refused, probably, but I would have respected it more than this. She looked out the window. He calculated that I would rather be deceived than inconvenienced, that a woman in my position would prefer not to be bothered. A pause. I was wrong about that too. He was wrong about a great many things. I was wrong about you. She turned back. He needed you to behave the way you intended to behave at the beginning. He needed you to marry me for the fortune and treat me as manageable, and then he needed me to find out and run. She held his gaze. He did not anticipate that I would come back. He did not anticipate that I would change, Edward said, that there would be anything to change toward. The carriage moved over a rough patch of road. Neither of them looked away. Catherine. His voice was different from any register she had heard from him before, stripped of the managed distance he usually maintained, stripped of the careful formality that had been his protection since she had returned. I need to tell you something. She waited. When I was sitting in that study alone with those documents before you arrived, before Graves told you, I was not thinking about the legal problem. He paused. I was thinking that this was what I had done, not Ashby me. I handed him the instrument he needed. I behaved exactly the way he required me to behave, and I kept thinking. He stopped. Tell me. I kept thinking that if I had simply been honest with you from the beginning at the assembly before any of this, there would have been no instrument. There would have been nothing for him to use. You would have known about the debt and chosen accordingly, and whatever you chose, it would have been. A long pause. Real. She did not speak. I am not asking for absolution, he said. I know that's not how it works. I am only telling you that I understand now exactly what dishonesty cost. Not just what it cost you, what it cost me. His voice was quiet and precise. I had you, Catherine. Whatever you thought of me, whatever you were willing to give, I had it. And I made a choice that put that in the past tense, and I have been sitting with that ever since. The carriage was slowing toward the Livingston gate. She had carried his words very carefully at the beginning, like objects she was assessing for damage. But she had been assessing them for 3 months, and she was tired of assessment. She was tired of the controlled, managed, sensible approach to a feeling that had never been controlled or managed or sensible. Edward. She turned to face him fully. I am going to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. He nodded. I came back because I needed to understand you. That was true. But I have understood you for some time now, and I have been continuing to come back for a different reason that I have been unwilling to name. She held his gaze. I have continued coming back because I am not willing to lose something real, simply because it began dishonestly. And what is between us, whatever complicated, infuriating, inconvenient thing has been growing since I first walked back through your door, is real. She paused. I am not forgiving you. Not fully, not yet, not quickly, because what you did was a significant thing, and I owe myself more than a quick forgiveness. But I am telling you that I am not finished." His expression was very still. "With what?" he said quietly. "With you." A silence that contained a great deal. He did not reach for her hand. He did not perform the moment. He simply looked at her with the full, unguarded attention she had decided was the truest thing about him, and breathed. "All right," he said, "just that." The carriage stopped. She stepped down. She turned back for a moment. "Thursday. Patterson needs the survey documents." "I'll have them there." She nodded and went inside, and she allowed herself just inside the entrance hall, just for a moment, with no one watching, to press one hand flat against the door and breathe. She did not have long to breathe. The morning arrived with Margaret at an hour that would have been unreasonable under any other circumstances, and Margaret's face told Catherine immediately that something had happened. "Sit down," Catherine said. "I am sitting down." "You're standing in my hallway about to deliver news. Sit down first." Margaret sat. "Gerald Ashby was at the Cartwright dinner last night." Catherine waited. "He spoke to people, Catherine. Specifically, he spoke to Viola Cartwright and Edmund Sears and 3 other people who will have spoken to 15 others by this morning." Margaret's voice was careful. "He is telling a version of events. His version. He is saying that the engagement was always unstable, that Edward Caldwell's financial situation was common knowledge, and that you ended the engagement because you discovered the financial problems and found them unacceptable. He is positioning himself as a concerned relation. Cold. Clarity. A concerned relation who stepped in to protect me from a bad match. Yes. He is establishing a narrative in which he is the protective party." Catherine understood it completely now. So that when the legal challenge comes, when Patterson files the response, and Ashby's actions become record, he has already shaped how people will read it. He will say, "He was only trying to protect my interests." Margaret stared at her. "You already knew he might do this." "I thought he might." She stood. "But I didn't expect him to do it before we filed. He's moving faster than I anticipated." She began to think. "He's heard something. Someone told him we were at Patterson's office Monday. Someone in Richmond who saw us arrive." She looked at Margaret. "He knows we're challenging, and he's trying to control the public record before the legal record can speak. What do? We move faster." She sent a note to Patterson before noon. She sent a note to Edward after that. And then she did something she had not done in 20 years of careful, managed, sensible social behavior. She called on Viola Cartwright. Viola was 56, had been the center of Richmond's social intelligence network for 30 years, had known Catherine's mother, and had eyes that cataloged everything and forgot nothing. She received Catherine in her front parlor with the expression of a woman who has been expecting a visit and is gratified to have her expectation confirmed. "Gerald Ashby spoke to you last night," Catherine said without preamble. Viola's expression didn't change. "He did. He told you a version of events regarding the cancelled engagement. He told me his version, which I did not entirely credit." Viola tilted her head. "You are here to tell me yours." "No." Catherine met her eyes. "I am here to tell you the true one." She did not tell all of it. She told the parts that needed to be heard: the Ashworth letter, the Eastern parcel, the legal claim constructed to create delay, the survey documents that Ashby had been sitting on for 3 years while he positioned himself to benefit from them. She told it plainly, without drama, in the way you tell something when you want it to be remembered accurately. Viola listened without interrupting. When Catherine finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He has been planning this for 3 years, Viola said, "at minimum. And you and Edward Caldwell were. We were the mechanism he intended to use." Steady. A man in debt, a woman with a fortune, a situation that could be made to look like a natural collapse. She paused. "It would have worked if I had run." Viola looked at her for a long time. "But you didn't run." "No." "Why?" Catherine considered the question. She had not expected it. She had expected Viola to move immediately into the social arithmetic of what this meant and who needed to know and how to manage it. The personal question caught her off guard. Because, she said finally, I am not a woman who lets other people decide what her life means. Not Ashby, not anyone. Viola Cartwright nodded, once the nod of a woman who has made similar decisions in different rooms over many decades, and knows the particular quality of resolve that produces them. Leave Mr. Ashby to me, she said. The announcement arrived in the form of Ashby himself. He came to the Livingston estate on a Thursday morning without notice, which was either bold or desperate, and Catherine received him in her father's old study, because it was the most authoritative room in the house, and she wanted the advantage of it. How was a well-made man in his mid-40s, with a face that defaulted to pleasantness, and eyes that were always doing something other than what the face suggested. He sat in the offered chair with easy confidence, and looked around the room with the casual inventory of a man who has been imagining owning it. Catherine. Warm. Familial. The particular intimacy of someone claiming a connection they have not earned. I've been so concerned. This whole business with the Caldwells. Gerald. She folded her hands on the desk. I know about the Eastern parcel. A pause. Very brief. Almost undetectable if you weren't watching for it. I don't know what I know about the survey from last spring. I know about Theodore Ashworth and the legal claim he filed on your direction. I know that you have been positioning for access to that parcel for 3 years. She held his gaze. I know that you needed my engagement to fail, and you needed it to fail in a specific way on my initiative, so that you could use the breach as a legal instrument. I know all of it, Gerald. His face had gone through pleasantness and out the other side into something much more neutral and watchful. That is quite an accusation, he said. It is a description of documented events. She slid the copy of Patterson's summary letter across the desk. My solicitors have the survey documents, the correspondence with Ashworth, and a chain of financial records going back to 1812. The legal challenge was filed Tuesday morning. She paused. We are not waiting for you to finish positioning yourself. We are finished waiting. He looked at the letter. He didn't pick it up. You would expose your own family, he said. A canceled engagement. A public legal dispute. The Livingston name. The Livingston name belongs to me. Her voice was entirely even. And I will put it exactly where I choose. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the shift of a man dropping one approach and calculating another. Catherine, whatever you think happened there may be ways to resolve this without. There are not. The parcel is not for sale, not to you, not under any arrangement, not now, not after this is resolved, not in 10 years. She stood. You are welcome to pursue the legal challenge. Patterson tells me the process will be interesting. She looked at him steadily. I suggest you consult your own solicitor before it becomes more than interesting. He left. She stood in her father's study for a long time, afterward, looking at the letter still on the desk, and thought about what it meant to finally put the full force of herself behind something rather than managing it carefully from behind a wall of sensibility. It felt, she discovered, like something she should have done years ago. Edward arrived the following morning. She had not sent for him. He had heard from his own solicitor, presumably that the challenge was filed, and he came the way he had been coming for weeks now, without pretense. She met him in the entrance hall. He looked at her face and understood immediately that something had happened beyond the legal filing. Ashby came, he said, yesterday morning. Are you? I'm perfectly all right. She almost smiled. He is considerably less all right. He did not expect me to be prepared for him. Edward was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression was difficult to read. Not the managed composure she had known at the beginning, not the rawness of the study 24 hours into a crisis. Something in between, something she was only beginning to have a vocabulary for. I should have been here, he said. No. She met his eyes. I needed to do that alone. I needed to know I could. He understood. She could see it, the recognition that what she had just said was not about shutting him out, but about something more fundamental. The difference between a woman who is protected and a woman who is capable. And, he asked quietly, I can. A pause. I also need you to know something. She held his gaze. When I walked into that study to face him, I was not thinking about the parcel, or the legal documents, or the Livingston name. She paused. I was thinking about the fact that he tried to use the worst moment of my life as a tool. He needed me to be devastated enough and isolated enough to be moved. Her voice was very level. And I wasn't, because I came back instead of running. Because whatever has happened between us these past months, for all its difficulty, for all of what it cost, it put me in a position to see clearly when I needed to. She looked at him steadily. You did not give me that. I gave myself that. But you the choice to stay, to come back to look at this honestly, that was mine and it was right and he miscalculated because of it. Edward looked at her for a long time. Is that, he said finally very carefully, the closest thing to a thank you I am going to receive? Yes, she said. For now. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the unguarded kind. I'll take it, he said. She nodded. Good, because there is something else. He waited. My solicitor has advised that the strongest position we can take legally and socially is a unified one. She chose her next words with care. Ashby's narrative depends on us being fractured. It depends on the broken engagement being the truth of this story. A man who was dishonest, a woman who was deceived, a natural separation. If that remains the narrative, his legal position is stronger, and his social position is stronger. She held his gaze. We need to change the narrative. The silence that followed was not long, but it contained everything. What are you proposing? His voice was very quiet. She had thought about this. She had thought about it from every angle, practical, personal, emotional, strategic. She had thought about whether she was making a decision, or simply naming one she had already made in a stable in December with a frightened horse between them. She had thought about what it meant to do something that could not be undone. She had thought about her father's letter in the desk drawer, trying anyway. I am proposing, she said steadily, that we stop pretending we don't know what this has become, that we stop managing it from a careful distance. She looked at him fully without armor. I am proposing that you ask me again, properly, and that this time I say yes. The room was very still. Edward looked at her with the full, unguarded, unreserved attention she had decided was the truest thing about him, and when he spoke his voice was so quiet she had to lean slightly forward to catch it. Catherine Livingston. He did not reach for her hand. He did not drop to one knee. They were not those kinds of people, and they both knew it. He simply looked at her as though she were the only legible thing in an otherwise illegible world. Will you marry me not for the fortune, not for the name, not for the legal position or the social narrative? A pause. Will you marry me because you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and because I would like if you'll allow it to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that? She let the moment be what it was. She let herself feel it fully, the thing she had been holding at careful distance for 3 months. The feeling that had been growing in the space where the wound had been cautious and real, and entirely hers. Yes, she said. On the condition that you understand this is a beginning, not a conclusion. We have a great deal of work to do. I know. And I will not be managed. I know that too. The precursor to a smile became the thing itself. Genuine, unguarded, the smile of a man who has been given something he was not sure he deserved and intends to honor it. God help me. I think that's what I love most about you. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went to find Graves and told him they would need tea for 2, and that he should look somewhat less unsurprised than he clearly was. Graves brought the tea without a word, set it between them, with the precision of a man who has learned that the most significant moments in a household tend to arrange themselves around ordinary things, and withdrew so quietly they barely heard him go. Catherine poured. Edward watched her do it, the way he had been watching her do everything for 3 months, with the attention of a man who has understood too late, and then just in time, what he was actually looking at. They did not speak immediately. There was a particular quality to the silence between them now that was different from every previous silence, not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of 2 people sitting inside a decision they have just made together and finding it steadier than expected. You said this is a beginning, Edward said finally, not a conclusion. Yes. I want to understand what that means, specifically. She set down the teacup. She looked at him with the directness that had always been, he thought, the most disarming thing about her, the way she never softened her gaze to make things easier. It means that a yes is not the same as a full trust, she said. I have agreed to move forward with you. I have not pretended that what happened before is erased. Those are two different things, and I need you to hold both of them at once, without collapsing one into the other. You're saying don't mistake the agreement for the forgiveness. I'm saying that the forgiveness will come. I believe it will. I am working toward it, but it cannot be declared. It has to be built. And that is work that happens over time, not in a parlor over tea. He was quiet for a moment. What does that work look like from where you're standing? She appreciated that he asked rather than assumed, that she thought was already different from the man she had overheard in the study. It looks like honesty, she said. Not the kind that comes after the fact when you're accounting for damage already done. The other kind. The kind where you tell me a difficult thing before it becomes a crisis. She paused. The Ashworth letter. You sat with that alone for 24 hours. I was trying to understand it fully before burdening me with it. He recognized the word. Yes, that is a version of the same mistake, she said not unkindly. The decision to manage what I know and when I know it, even when the intention is protection. She held his gaze. I do not need protecting from difficult information, Edward. I need to be trusted with it. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it, not defensively, not with the instinct to explain himself, but with the particular quality of a man taking something in because he intends to use it. All right, he said. Honesty before management. I understand. And I will do the same. She picked up her cup again. That goes both directions. I have not been entirely without my own managed silences in these past months. He almost smiled. I know. You knew. I knew you were observing more than you were saying. I assumed you had reasons. A pause. I tried to respect that. You did. She considered him. That was not nothing, Edward. That patience, it mattered. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the winter afternoon was going dark, early the way Virginia winters did without ceremony. There is something else, she said. The debt. He looked at her steadily. What about it? I want to know the full picture, not Patterson's summary, not the version you gave me on the walk in November, the real number, all of it. Something flickered behind his eyes. The old instinct, the trained reflex of a man who had spent years arranging the presentation of his family's troubles to minimize alarm. She watched him recognize it in himself. It's significant, he said. I assumed. Tell me anyway, he told her. The full number. Not the managed version, not the one with the softening context wrapped around it, but the raw figure that had been keeping his mother awake and had sent him into a Richmond assembly room looking for a Livingston. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She listened with the focused attention of someone who is hearing information they intend to act on. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, and your plan before the original plan. What specifically did you intend regarding the Livingston assets? I told her that too. All of it. The provisions he had anticipated, access to the timeline he had constructed, the way he had intended to structure the post-marriage financial arrangements to benefit the Caldwell recovery. He told it flatly, without self-pity or self-justification, because she had asked for the truth, and he had promised honesty before management. When he finished, she nodded slowly. Thank you. He looked at her. For what? For telling me without making me drag it out of you. A beat. Then, it doesn't trouble you. Hearing the specifics of, it troubles me a great deal, she said plainly. And I would rather be troubled by the truth than comfortable with a version of it. She set down her cup with a decisiveness that meant the subject was not closed, but the first examination of it was complete. We will figure out the debt together, not with the Livingston fortune as a solution, not as a transaction, as two people who are building something and need to understand what they're building on. She met his eyes. Is that acceptable? More than acceptable. Good. She stood. Then let us begin with what we can actually address today, which is Patterson and Thursday, and the survey documents. He rose too. And in the movement, the ordinary purposeful shift, from sitting to standing, from feeling to doing something settled between them that hadn't been settled before. Not resolved, not finished, but grounded. Two people who had agreed to try with clear eyes and without pretending the ground beneath them was smoother than it was. That Catherine thought was the most honest foundation she had ever stood on. The legal challenge moved faster than Ashby had anticipated, which was Patterson's particular genius. He was a man who understood that in legal matters, speed was its own kind of argument. By the second week of January, the counter-filing was complete. The survey documents were entered into record, and the chain of correspondence between Ashby and Ashworth had been placed before the court in terms that left very little interpretive room. Ashby hired his own solicitor, of course, a man named Crow from Charlottesville, who had a reputation for creative argument and had once extended a boundary dispute in Albemarle County for 4 years through procedural ingenuity. Catherine read the summary of Crow's initial response and recognized immediately what he was attempting: a slow dismantling of the timeline, casting doubt on when Ashby had known about the survey results, attempting to reframe the legal claim as a sincere exercise of trustee responsibility rather than a manufactured instrument. She went to Richmond with Edward on a Thursday and spent 4 hours with Patterson going through every weakness in Crow's argument, and by the end of the afternoon, she understood exactly what the next 6 weeks were going to look like and was not intimidated by any of it. What she had not anticipated was the social dimension arriving before the legal one resolved. It began with an invitation. The Harrington Winter Assembly, one of the largest gatherings of the Richmond season, a 3-day event that the social calendar organized itself around. Catherine received her invitation in the normal way. Margaret sent a note the same afternoon. "Have you seen the guest list Gerald Ashby is attending?" His name was added after the initial list was circulated. Someone pulled strings. She read the note twice. Then she wrote to Edward. He arrived within the hour, which was becoming his particular habit. The promptness of a man who has learned that distance when someone you care about has sent for you is its own kind of statement. "Ashby at the Harrington Assembly," she said, handing him Margaret's note. He read it. His jaw tightened. He's going to use the social setting to work the room before the legal situation resolves. Control the narrative while the court process is still in motion. "That's my reading." She looked at him. "We should go. Together." Emphatically together. She met his eyes. "I need you to understand what that means. We will be visible. People will watch us. There will be conversation we cannot control, questions we cannot fully answer yet, and at least 3 women who will find reasons to speak to you about Miss Finch or some suitable alternative." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to know, the one that meant he was about to say something direct, and had decided not to manage its directness. "Catherine, I have not thought about Miss Finch or any suitable alternative since the evening at the Whitmore Assembly, when I crossed a room to stand beside you, and discovered that you are the only person in any room I have any real interest in." A pause. "That has not changed." She held his gaze for a moment. All right. I believe you. Simply, let's go to the Harrington Assembly." They arrived on the second evening, which was the most attended and the most observed. Catherine wore the deep blue silk. Margaret had said correctly that it was the right choice, and Edward arrived with the composure of a man who has made his position clear to himself and has nothing left to be uncertain about. The room read them immediately. That was the nature of Richmond society. It processed new information the way a body processes a change in temperature rapidly and with full attention. The murmur that moved through the assembly as they entered together was almost audible. Catherine kept her head up and her pace steady, and her expression the particular combination of calm and certainty that she had learned from her mother and spent 30 years refining. At her side, Edward did the same. She felt it not as a performance, but as something real. 2 people presenting a unified thing because the thing was real, not because they had agreed to perform it. The first test came within 20 minutes. Mrs. Edmund Sears, One of the women Ashby had spoken to at the Cartwright dinner appeared at Catherine's elbow with the brightness of a woman who has been waiting for an opportunity. "Catherine, my dear, what a surprise to see you and Mr. Caldwell together." The last word did a great deal of work. "Good evening, Patricia." Catherine's tone was warm and exactly as informative as she intended it to be. "Yes, we've been spending a good deal of time together recently, managing some rather complicated property matters. I'm sure you've heard there's been a legal situation involving a branch of my father's estate that has required quite a bit of attention from both our families." Patricia Sears looked between them. "I had heard something. I imagine you had. Gerald Ashby has been circulating a version of it." Catherine let a beat pass just long enough to be deliberate. "When the legal proceedings conclude, the full record will be public. I expect it will be clarifying." She smiled. "Now how is Edmund? I heard he had some trouble with the north pasture fencing." Patricia Sears outmaneuvered, and aware of it, redirected to her husband's fencing. Edward said nothing during this exchange. When Patricia moved away, he leaned slightly toward Catherine. "You are extraordinary." "I know how to talk to Patricia Sears." She kept her voice low. "The important thing is that she will repeat exactly what I said and use approximately the same words. That is how this works." "Do you ever get tired of it?" She considered the question honestly. "Sometimes. But I grew up in this room, Edward. I know every current and undertow in it. That is not a small thing, and I intend to use it." They had been in the assembly an hour when she saw Ashby. He was across the room in conversation with two men she recognized as having business interests that occasionally intersected with the Livingston estate's eastern boundary. He had not yet seen them, or had seen them, and was delaying acknowledgement, which amounted to the same thing strategically. He looked comfortable, the look of a man who believes the ground beneath him is solid. She looked at Edward. "Do you want to go to him, or let him come to us?" Edward considered this. "He will have to come to us eventually. Every minute he waits, people are watching him not come." "That's my thought." She turned slightly towards the center of the room. "Then we give him something to watch while he waits." What followed was on its surface an ordinary evening at a Richmond assembly. Catherine spoke to Viola Cartwright, who received her with the quiet satisfaction of a woman whose assessment of a situation has been confirmed. She spoke to Patterson's wife, who was present, and who communicated through a series of entirely proper social signals that the legal situation was proceeding as anticipated. She spoke to 3 other couples and managed 2 separate conversations about estate management that were coded enough to be useful and ordinary enough to be unremarkable. Through all of it, Edward was at her side, not as a decoration or a bodyguard, but as a partner engaged in his own conversations, contributing to hers, when it was useful, stepping back when it wasn't. It was, she thought, watching him speak to old Judge Hardin about the Virginia property statutes with calm authority. The first real glimpse of what it could actually be. The thing she had cautiously, carefully against every sensible instinct begun to hope for. Ashby approached when he had run out of alternatives, which was the only way Catherine had expected it to happen. He came to her directly, which was either brave or foolish, and positioned himself between her and Edward with the ease of a man claiming space. "Catherine." The same warmth, the same familial presumption. "I hadn't expected to see you here." "Gerald." She was pleasant and precise, and gave him nothing. "I believe you know Mr. Caldwell." A moment between the 2 men that contained everything they were not going to say in public. "Of course." Ashby's smile didn't move. "I hope the situation is resolving itself to everyone's satisfaction." "I expect it will," Catherine said. "Once the full record is in front of the court, I think most things will become quite clear." She met his eyes. "I've always found that clarity is the best resolution, don't you? Much better than drawn-out ambiguity." His smile held, but his eyes changed. She had spent 3 months learning to read Edward Caldwell's expressions with accuracy, and that exercise had made her considerably better at reading everyone else's. "Quite right," he said. "Well, I hope we can put all of this behind us soon." "I'm sure we will." She turned back to the conversation she had been having, and Edward turned with her, and they left Ashby standing in his own withdrawal. He didn't approach them again that evening. Tate. The twist arrived at midnight. They were preparing to leave Catherine saying her last farewells. Edward retrieving her wrap from a footman when Margaret appeared at her elbow with an expression she had never worn before. Urgent and controlled in the particular way of someone carrying information that cannot be uncarried. "I need to speak to you," Margaret said, quietly. "Not here, outside." The three of them stepped into the cold of the Harrington entrance hall, away from the sound of the assembly. "I was speaking to Thomas Keene," Margaret said, and Catherine recognized the name, a solicitor's clerk who moved through Richmond's social circles more widely than his professional position might suggest. He had Margaret stopped. She looked between Catherine and Edward. "He had information about why Ashby moved the timeline forward, why he's been more aggressive than expected in the past weeks. Tell me, he's heard something about the will." Margaret met her cousin's eyes. "Your father's will. There is apparently a codicil, a secondary provision, that Thomas has seen referenced in Ashworth's files. Thomas doesn't know the full content, but the provision appears to relate to a secondary disposal of the eastern parcel under specific circumstances." She paused. "Circumstances that may include the question of whether you marry before a particular date." The entrance hall went very quiet in Catherine's perception. "What date?" Edward asked. Thomas didn't know exactly. He only saw a reference, but he believes it's... Margaret looked at her cousin steadily. "He believes it's the 1st of March. 6 weeks away." Catherine stood in the cold hallway and felt the shape of it rearrange in her mind. Gerald Ashby's aggression, the Cartwright dinner, the Harrington assembly, the move to file before the legal challenge could be completed. It had felt premature, but she had attributed it to panic. Now she understood it was calculation. He knew about the codicil. He knew there was a date. And every day that Catherine remained unmarried was a day closer to whatever provision her father had written into his estate. "We need to see the will," she said, not to Margaret, to herself. "Tonight?" Edward asked. "Tomorrow morning, first thing." She turned to him. "Whatever that codicil says, whether it favors or complicates our position, I need to know before Ashby can use it. Do you still have the original documents at the estate?" "Yes. My father kept his final documents in the study safe." She thought rapidly. "Patterson will need to see them too. I'll send word tonight." They left the Harrington assembly 20 minutes later than planned, and during the drive home, Catherine sat with the information and let herself feel what it produced. Not panic, not the disorienting shock of discovering another layer of something that had already been complicated. Something more focused than either. The feeling of a woman who has been navigating a situation she thought she understood and has just discovered the map had a room she didn't know about. She had learned these past months that unknown rooms were not the same as impassable ones. Patterson arrived at the Livingston estate at 8 the following morning. Edward arrived at 8:15, which meant he had been on the road before 7. Graves let him in without comment. The safe was in her father's study. Catherine opened it herself. She had memorized the combination at 17, and her father had never changed it. Inside were the documents she had reviewed after his death, the ones she had believed she knew entirely. The codicil was at the bottom. She did not know how she had missed it. Looking at it now, a single folded page appended to the main will, in a manner her father's primary solicitor had apparently not been aware of, sealed with a separate notation. She understood that it had not been missing, but hidden. Her father had placed it here intentionally beneath the documents she had examined with a quiet deliberateness that was entirely characteristic of him. Patterson read it once in silence, then again. His eyebrows communicated several things. "Well," he said. "Tell me," Catherine said. He set the document on the desk. "The eastern parcel is designated as a restricted asset," he said. "It cannot be sold, transferred, or encumbered by third-party claim during a period your father defined as the years of your primary estate. Specifically, and this is the operative language, the restriction lifts entirely upon your marriage, at which point you hold it with full unencumbered title." He paused. "The restriction also lifts under a secondary provision on the 1st of March in the year following your father's death. But under that provision, the parcel transfers to the secondary trust, not to you." The room was completely silent. Catherine understood it in a single breath. Her father had written this provision to protect her. He had known or suspected that there would be people with interests in the eastern parcel. He had built in a provision that gave her a clear path to full ownership through marriage. He had also built in a deadline because he had been a practical man who understood that provisions without deadlines create ambiguity. What he had not anticipated was that someone would discover the deadline and use it as a weapon. "Ashby knows about the March provision," Edward said. His voice was very controlled. "He knows that if Catherine marries before March, she holds the parcel outright. If she doesn't, it enters the secondary trust which Ashworth administers." "Which Ashby controls through Ashworth," Patterson confirmed. "My father didn't know about Ashworth," Catherine said. "Almost certainly not. Ashworth was appointed trustee in 1812. Your father's health was declining by then. It's possible the appointment was made by someone in the estate administration, without your father's full knowledge, or with his partial knowledge of a man whose connection to Ashby wasn't then apparent." She looked at the codicil. Her father's handwriting, careful and precise, had written something intended as protection, and had become through a chain of events. He couldn't have predicted the instrument of the threat against her. She felt a complicated grief about that, not for the legal situation, but for him. For the man who had tried to take care of her from beyond his own death and had not been able to anticipate everything. She folded the codicil carefully and set it on the desk. "March 1st, she said. "Yes," Patterson confirmed. "That gives us approximately 6 weeks." She looked at Edward. He was watching her with the controlled expression he wore when he was managing something that had the potential to become very large. "You understand," she said carefully, "that this changes the pressure on the timeline." "Yes. We agreed that this was a beginning, that forgiveness is built over time, not declared." She held his gaze. "I am not going to let a date written into a legal document collapse that agreement. I need you to understand that." "I understand." He was very steady. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that we will not make this decision based on a deadline. We will make it based on what's right." She turned to Patterson. "What are our options?" Patterson considered. "If you marry before March 1st, you hold the parcel outright, and the secondary trust provision is moot. Ashby's claim is significantly weakened even before the court challenge resolves." He paused. "If you do not marry, the March provision activates, the parcel enters the secondary trust, and the legal challenge becomes considerably more complex." "There's a third option," Edward said. Both Catherine and Patterson looked at him. "The secondary trust provision requires a trustee to execute it," he said. "If Ashworth can be removed from the trustee position, if it can be demonstrated that his appointment was improperly administered, or that he has been acting in bad faith, the March provision has no executor." Patterson was very still for a moment. Then slowly, "That would require demonstrating that Ashworth's original appointment was procedurally improper." "Yes. Is it possible?" Patterson picked up the codicil again. "The appointment was made in 1812. The records from that period in the Livingston Estate Administration are, I would need to examine them." He was already moving toward possibility. Catherine could hear it in his voice. "It's possible. If the appointment wasn't properly authorized, the trustee position is void." Catherine looked at Edward. He had not said this to create a way around the March deadline. He had said it because he had been sitting in her father's study for the past 20 minutes, thinking about the legal architecture of the situation, and had found a door she and Patterson had not found. He had been applying that same focused, methodical intelligence she had first seen in him over a stack of account ledgers to a problem that mattered to her. "How long would that take?" she asked Patterson. "To investigate the records, 2 weeks for a thorough examination. Then if we find grounds, another filing." He calculated. "Tight but possible before March." "Do it," she said. Patterson gathered his documents with the quiet efficiency of a man who already knows what he's going to find. When he left, Catherine and Edward were alone in her father's study, with the codicil on the desk between them. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "The third option." "I know. You could have argued very reasonably that the simplest solution was for us to simply accelerate. Get a license, be married before March, and the problem resolves itself." "Yes," he said. I could have. And a year ago I would have. She looked at him. What changed? I was quiet for a moment. You did, he said finally. Or rather, you didn't change. You were always who you are. I just stopped looking past you to see it. He met her eyes. You told me that what you needed was to be trusted with difficult information. You told me that decisions made without you are a version of the same mistake. So when I saw the third option, I offered it. A pause. Because the decision about whether to marry before March belongs to you, and I wasn't going to remove it by presenting only the convenient solutions. The room was very still. She looked at him for a long time, this man who had begun as a calculation and had become through the alchemical pressure of truth and consequence, and the stubborn refusal of both of them to take the easy path, something entirely else, something she had not expected and could not now imagine being without. Ask me, she said quietly. He looked at her. The question you want to ask. Ask it. His voice was very careful. What would you like to do about March? She had already known the answer for longer than she had been willing to admit. I would like, she said, to marry you before March. Not because of the deadline, not because of the parcel, or the legal position, or Gerald Ashby and his timeline. She held his gaze. Because I have been watching you choose correctly again and again in the moments when it would have been easier to choose otherwise. Because the man in this room right now is not the man behind the study door, and I know the difference. She paused. And because I am tired of being careful with something I have already decided to keep. The silence was absolute. Then Edward Caldwell, who had spent the better part of a year learning as he had described it, which of his father's choices were worth keeping, reached across the desk, careful and certain, and took her hand in both of his. He did not say anything for a moment. He simply held her hand and looked at her, and in his expression was everything he had been too managed to show at the beginning, and was now entirely unable to conceal. I will spend the rest of my life, he said quietly, making certain you never have reason to regret that. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was the kind of promise a person makes when they have finally run out of space between the feeling and the words. When the distance they've been maintaining collapses of its own structural failure, and what remains is simply the true thing. She believed him. Not blindly, she was constitutionally incapable of blind belief, and he knew it, and that was part of why it worked. She believed him the way you believe someone who has shown you their work, who has let you see the process, the false starts and the corrections and the unglamorous daily effort of becoming better than you were. She turned her hand in his and held it back. They sat like that in her father's study, the woman who had refused to run, and the man who had finally understood why, and the winter light came through the window, and somewhere in the house, Graves moved with deliberate quietness, as though he understood that the particular silence in the study was the kind that should not be interrupted. The case against Gerald Ashby was still in motion. The codicil was still on the desk. There was still a great deal of work to be done, still honesty to be built, and trust to be earned, and the long, careful process of two people becoming something together. But the beginning had been made. Not the beginning of the engagement that had been made in a Richmond assembly room by a man who had seen a fortune and a woman who had seen something true in him that turned out to be, despite everything, actually there. The real beginning. The one that started with a door left slightly open and a woman who chose to stay. That beginning was made now, and it held. Patterson found the irregularity on a Wednesday. Catherine was at the Livingston estate, going through the secondary trust documents when his letter arrived. Not a formal correspondence, but a note in his own hand. Written quickly, the kind of writing a man produces when he has found something and cannot wait for proper stationery. Come to the office. Bring Mr. Caldwell. I have the Ashworth appointment records. She sent for Edward before she had finished reading it twice. He arrived in 40 minutes. She was already in her coat. Patterson's office in Richmond smelled as always of old paper and cold determination. He had the documents spread across his table in the particular arrangement of a man who has constructed a case and wants it witnessed in sequence. The appointment was made in August of 1812. He began without preamble. Your father was ill, seriously ill, the records confirm that. He was not receiving visitors. He was not by multiple accounts lucid for extended periods. He looked at Catherine steadily. The trustee appointment requires the grantor's signature and the signature of a qualified witness. The document has both. But, Edward said. Patterson turned the appointment page around on the table. The witness signature belongs to a man named Cornelius Webb. Mr. Webb was your father's private physician. A pause. Mr. Webb died in June of 1812, 2 months before the document is dated. The room went absolutely still. Catherine looked at the signature, then at the date. The arithmetic was simple and devastating. The witness was dead, she said. The witness was dead, Patterson confirmed. Which means the appointment document is fraudulent. Theodore Ashworth was never legally installed as secondary trustee. The position does not exist. The March provision has no executor. He folded his hands on the table. Gerald Ashby's entire legal architecture rests on a forged document. She had anticipated good news from this meeting. She had not anticipated this, not the clean, complete collapse of Ashby's position, not the discovery of something that transformed a complicated legal battle into something far simpler and far more damning. Edward was very still beside her. Who forged it? I cannot say with certainty yet. The signature is Webb's name, but not, I suspect, Webb's hand. A forensic examination will confirm. Patterson looked at them both. But I can tell you this. Someone knew your father was dying, knew the estate documents, knew about the codicil, and moved to install a cooperative trustee before your father could object or anyone could notice. This was not opportunism. This was planned years in advance. Catherine thought of Gerald Ashby at the Harrington Assembly, comfortable and certain. She thought of him in her father's study, looking around at the room as though he were already calculating the furniture. File immediately, she said. Everything. Don't wait for the forensic examination file on the documented impossibility of the witness being alive. We can add the handwriting analysis as supplementary. Patterson nodded. He had already drafted the filing. She could see it under his hands. This will be public, he said. Good. No hesitation. I want it public. The filing landed in Richmond's social consciousness approximately 24 hours after it landed in the court record, because that was how Richmond worked, and because Viola Cartwright had been prepared and used her preparation with the precision of a woman who has spent 30 years understanding exactly how information moves. By Thursday evening, the essential facts were in circulation. The forged witness, the dead physician, the fraudulent trustee appointment, the 3-year campaign against the Livingston Eastern parcel. By Friday morning, Gerald Ashby had left his lodgings in Richmond. By Friday afternoon, his solicitor Crow had filed notice of withdrawal from the case. Catherine heard about Crow's withdrawal from Patterson by messenger. She read the note standing in the entrance hall of the Livingston estate, and felt something she identified after a moment as the particular quiet that arrives after a sustained noise stops. Not triumph, something quieter and more complete than triumph. She sent a note to Edward. 4 words. It's over. Come tonight. He came at 7. Graves let him in with an expression that had finally, after 4 months of carefully maintained professional neutrality, allowed itself something in the vicinity of warmth. Catherine was in the front parlor, not the formal receiving room, but the smaller one, the one that had always been the actual living room of the Livingston house, the one with her mother's chair and her father's reading table, and the particular quality of a room that has been genuinely inhabited. Crow withdrew, she said when he came in. I heard. He sat down across from her with the ease of a man who has been somewhere enough times that it no longer requires permission. How do you feel? She considered the question honestly. I feel like someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been allowed to set it down. She looked at him. And I feel like I need to sleep for approximately a week. That seems reasonable. I also feel. She paused. Grateful, which is not an uncomplicated feeling. Grateful for what? For the fact that it was Ashby. She met his eyes. I know that sounds strange, but if his plan had worked, if I had never come back, if I had run the way he expected, I would never have known any of what I know now. About the estate, about the codicil, about what my father tried to build for me. A pause. about what was actually possible between us. Edward looked at her for a moment. You are finding the generous reading of Gerald Ashby's attempted fraud. I am finding the true reading of my own life. She looked down at her hands and then back up. I am not who I was in October. I don't think you are either. No, he said, quietly and completely. I am not. The wedding was set for the 14th of February. Margaret said it was either very romantic or very obvious, and Catherine told her it was practical. The 14th fell inside the required window and gave them adequate time for the arrangements that mattered without excess of the arrangements that didn't. Margaret gave her a look that communicated with the efficiency of 30 years of cousin knowledge that she was not fooling anyone. Catherine didn't particularly try. The preparations moved forward with a speed that surprised her. She had expected the logistics to feel burdensome, the license, the arrangements, the necessary social communications. Instead, she found that a wedding organized around two people who know exactly what they are doing and why requires remarkably little performance. The decisions came easily because they were grounded in something real. What mattered and what didn't had sorted itself out already. Eliza Caldwell came to call on a Tuesday 2 weeks before the wedding. Catherine received her in the front parlor and poured the tea herself, and they sat across from each other in the particular way of two women who have arrived at something through difficulty and are both aware of the distance traveled. I owe you an apology, Eliza said. She had said this before in November, the morning they had sat together and spoken with unusual honesty. But this apology was different, quieter, more specific. You don't? I do. Eliza's voice was steady. I told you in November that I wouldn't apologize for the arrangement, that I would make the same calculation again. She set down her cup. I was wrong about that. Catherine waited. I watched my son these past 4 months, Eliza said. I watched him do things I did not teach him to do, forgive a widow's debt, argue against me about choices I was certain were necessary, sit alone in a study for 24 hours with a legal problem and decide the solution was to give you more options rather than fewer. She looked at Catherine directly. I did not teach him those things, and I have been asking myself where he learned them. I didn't teach him either, Catherine said. They were already in him, perhaps, but you gave him a reason to use them. Eliza's voice was not sentimental. She was not a sentimental woman, and the sincerity of what she was saying was in part because it wasn't delivered as sentiment. I calculated a marriage that would save my family's name and did not consider that my son might need something more than that. I was wrong. A pause. I am glad you came back. I am glad you were stubborn enough to stay. And I am glad you said yes. Catherine looked at her future mother-in-law, the woman who had asked through a study door, and what about Catherine, and had not had the courage to push further, who had made her peace with diminished expectations, and had watched her son refuse to make the same peace, and felt something shift in the territory between them. Eliza. She leaned forward slightly. I am going to be honest with you about something. I expect nothing less. I will not be a daughter who defers. She held the older woman's gaze. I will not manage your son's household in the background and concern myself only with books and charity work as he once suggested. I will have opinions about the estate and the finances and the decisions that affect both our families, and I will voice them. Good, Eliza said, immediately, without qualification. Catherine had expected resistance. The absence of it was startling. Edward needs someone who argues with him. Eliza continued with the dry certainty of a woman who knows her son completely. He has always needed that. I was not able to be that person. I agreed with him when I should have pushed back and agreed with myself when I should have questioned. She looked at Catherine steadily. You argue with him. Constantly. Keep doing it. Catherine looked at her for a moment, and then for the first time in 4 months of navigating the complicated territory of the Caldwell family. She laughed. A real laugh. The kind that arrives when a situation reveals itself to be more human than expected. Eliza Caldwell. After a moment smiled. Not the managed social expression Catherine had known across a dozen careful parlor visits, but something underneath it. Something genuine, They finished their tea with considerably less formality than they had started it. The twist that arrived 9 days before the wedding was not legal, not social, and not something Catherine had seen coming. It came from Edward himself. He arrived in the morning without his usual composure, entirely intact, not shattered, not alarmed, but carrying something she could see from the moment Graves let him in. Something he had decided to bring to her directly, without sitting with it alone first. That she recognized was itself a change. "There is an offer," he said, standing in her father's study, because that was the room they had come to use for serious things. "For the Eastern parcel." She looked at him. "From whom?" "A timber consortium from Maryland. Legitimate, well-capitalized, no connection to Ashby." He met her eyes. "The offer is significant. Enough to retire the Caldwell debt in full with a remainder." The room was very quiet. She understood what he was bringing her. Not a question about the money he could see. She understood the numbers. He was bringing her the question behind the question. "You could have waited until after the wedding to tell me this," she said. "Yes. The parcel will be fully mine unencumbered once we're married. At that point you would have a legitimate interest in decisions about it." She held his gaze. "You could have waited." "I know." "Why didn't you?" He looked at her with the steady, unguarded expression she had decided was the truest version of him, the one that didn't manage its own visibility. "Because it's your father's land. Because he wrote a codicil trying to protect it for you. Because the decision about what to do with it belongs to you before it belongs to either of us together." A pause. "And because I told you I would bring you difficult information before it became something I'd already decided." She sat with that for a moment. He had learned. Not performed learning, actually done it. The difference was not subtle. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. He blinked. She suspected surprised him. "I think," he said carefully, "that the debt is my family's problem and should be solved by my family without using your inheritance as the instrument. I think the parcel was your father's careful provision for you and shouldn't be sold because it's convenient for the Caldwells." He paused. "I also think that if you wanted to sell it for your own reasons, that would be entirely your right. Those are two different positions. They're both true simultaneously." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not going to sell it." "All right." "Not because of... Your debt is real, and it needs solving, and I have thoughts about how. But not with this land. My father planted those timber stands himself. He walked that acreage every spring." She looked down at the desk surface and then back up. "Some things are worth more than their market value." "I know," he said, quietly. "I'm beginning to understand that quite well." She looked at him. "We'll solve the debt together. I have an idea about the Philadelphia creditors, a restructured arrangement that Patterson thinks is feasible. It won't be fast, but it will be honest." She paused. "Can you live with slow and honest?" After the alternative, the edge of a smile. "Yes, I can live with that." The 14th arrived the way significant days do, with the ordinary texture of a morning that doesn't know yet it's going to be remembered. Catherine dressed without fuss. Margaret was there as she had always been, and they did not make speeches at each other. Margaret handed her the small pearl earrings that had been her mother's and didn't say anything, and Catherine put them on, and they looked at each other in the glass for a moment, with 30 years of shared history between them, and that was sufficient. The ceremony was small. Catherine had insisted on that, and Edward had agreed without requiring a reason, because he had learned to recognize when she was asking for something that mattered at a level below argument. The drawing room at Caldwell Manor. A minister who had known both families for 20 years, the people who needed to be there, and no others. She walked in on her own. She had considered this carefully. There was no one to give her away. Her father was gone, and she was a woman of 31, who had navigated 4 months of legal combat and personal reckoning, and had come to this room by her own choosing. The idea of being handed from one person to another felt inaccurate to everything the past months had been. She walked in, and she walked toward him, and he was watching her come with an expression she had learned to read, and would spend the rest of her life being grateful for not the composure, not the management, but the thing underneath. The man who said remarkable in an empty room. The man who opened a legal problem to give her more options instead of fewer. The man who had looked at himself honestly and not much liked what he found, and had decided that was a reason to change rather than to conceal. I was not perfect. She was not fool enough to believe otherwise, and she was not a woman who needed perfect. She needed real. She had found it. The minister asked the questions that ministers ask, and the answers were given clearly and without hesitation. And the ring, not the original, not the Caldwell family piece she had returned with the cancelled engagement, but a new one chosen together, simple and well-made, was placed on her finger, and this time it did not feel like a brand. It felt like an agreement between equals. The reception afterward was exactly the size it needed to be, and no larger. Viola Cartwright was there, and Patterson with his wife, and Graves had somehow elevated himself to a guest, without anyone quite being able to say how. Margaret cried at a volume she would later deny. Eliza Caldwell stood straight-backed and clear-eyed, and did not cry, but once briefly pressed Catherine's hand between both of hers, in a grip that said everything her composure wouldn't. It was in the late afternoon that Edward found her standing apart for a moment, not from distress, just from the particular need of someone who processes large things by occasionally stepping outside them briefly. He came and stood beside her without asking if she was all right, because he knew she was all right, and he knew she knew it. "I have been thinking," he said, "about something you said in October." She glanced at him. "I said a great many things in October. You said you came back because you were not willing to let fear make your decisions for you." She remembered. The exact conversation her father's study, the first honest exchange they had managed. "I have thought about that sentence nearly every day since," he said, "because I spent a very long time letting fear make mine. Fear of the debt. Fear of my mother's disappointment. Fear of being the Caldwell who lost the estate." He looked at her. "Fear is an extraordinary motivator. It is also, I have found, an extraordinarily poor guide." "What replaced it?" she asked. Howe was quiet for a moment. "You," he said simply. "Not as a solution. Not as an answer to an arithmetic problem." He turned to face her fully. "You as a direction. Something to move toward rather than something to acquire." A pause. "Does that make sense?" She looked at him. This man she had overheard through a door and refused to abandon, and had spent 4 months watching choose correctly in the moments that counted. This man who was not what she had thought he was at the beginning, and not what she had feared he was in the middle, and who was turning out with the slow, reliable persistence of something actually true to be exactly what she needed. "Yes," she said. "That makes a great deal of sense." He offered his arm. She took it. Tall. The Ashby case concluded in March, 3 weeks after the wedding, with a judgment that Patterson described as comprehensive, and that Richmond society described with the particular relish reserved for the complete collapse of a scheme that had been constructed with too much cleverness and too little integrity. The fraudulent trustee appointment was voided. The legal claim was dismissed. Gerald Ashby, who had returned briefly to the city to contest the final filing, left again before the judgment was handed down and did not return. The eastern parcel remained exactly where it was. Catherine's, exactly as her father had intended. The Caldwell debt was restructured across 3 years through a negotiated agreement with the Philadelphia creditors that Patterson had called ambitious, and Catherine had called simply accurate, an honest accounting of what was owed, and a realistic plan for meeting it, without requiring anyone to sacrifice what shouldn't be sacrificed. It was not a fast solution. It was not a clean one. It required 3 years of careful management and more than 1 difficult quarter, and at least 2 conversations between Catherine and Eliza Caldwell that were not comfortable and were entirely necessary. It worked. That was the thing. The slow, honest, unglamorous approach worked the way slow and honest things tend to when the people doing them have decided to be rigorous. Edward, in the 2nd year of this process, made a decision without consulting Catherine, and then catching himself came and told her what he'd almost done and why he'd stopped. She had looked at him across her father's desk, their shared desk now in the study that had become the room where things were decided, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not irritation at the near miss, not gratification at the self-correction. Pride. The specific pride of someone who has watched another person do the hard work of becoming better and has seen it take hold. She told him as much. He had looked at her in the way she had first fallen in love with, and would never entirely stop being disarmed by, and said, "You set the standard." "We set the standard," she corrected. He accepted the correction. He always did. In the spring of the second year, Thomas, the old groundskeeper, who had worked 3 acres alone and had been quietly given help, planted a kitchen garden that exceeded all previous seasons. He told Edward about it with the dignity of a man reporting something that matters, and Edward came home that evening and told Catherine, and they were both quiet for a moment, with the particular satisfaction of things that compound slowly in the right direction. "Your father would have done that," Catherine said. "The help in the garden." "Yes." Edward looked at the letter Thomas had sent. "I am trying to collect more of his choices and fewer of his debts." She thought of a man in rolled sleeves cross-referencing 20 years of ledgers, keeping the parts worth keeping. She thought of the moment in the stable when he had stood quietly with a frightened horse and waited because he knew that some things cannot be rushed. She thought of a letter with 3 sentences. "I know I have no right. I know what I said. I am asking anyway." She had carried that letter in her memory through everything that followed the legal filings and the social maneuvering and the difficult conversations and the ordinary daily work of building something real. She had never asked him about those 3 sentences in the way you ask about something you're still uncertain of. She had not needed to. She had understood what they meant from the beginning. Not an apology that erases, not a promise that resolves, but the simple statement of a man choosing to try. It had been enough to start. Everything else, the trust rebuilt piece by careful piece, the honesty that had become their actual language rather than their aspiration, the life that had grown up around both of them, without their quite noticing until it was already there, everything else had followed from that beginning, from a door left slightly open, from a woman who heard the worst thing and stayed anyway, from a man who discovered just in time that there was a difference between protecting a name and deserving one. Catherine Caldwell. She had taken the name easily without grief, because it was her choice, sat in the garden of Caldwell Manor, in the May of that second year, with her husband beside her, and the eastern timberland, visible in the distance, and the knowledge settled and certain in her chest that her father had tried to build her something worth keeping. She had kept it. She had built something better, and that the stubborn, clear-eyed, unglamorous, wholly triumphant fact of it was more than enough.